And now, Classic Romance Stories with Karen Teeters, brought to you by Far Out Radio Productions.
Hi, this is Karen Teeters, narrator and producer of Classic Romance Stories. In the first half of the 20th century, people could get lost in the creative short stories dished up in pulp fiction magazines that blanketed every corner newsstand in the U.S. and U.K. These weeklies provided crime, adventure, science fiction, and romance stories that fed the need for entertainment to the average Joe and Jane. I Confess, True Romance, Love Story, and New Love were just a few titles of the romance magazines that made an average girl or woman yearn for more. These stories offer a window into a time gone by. I invite you to get lost down memory lane, where dollops of sweet values and happy endings were served up to enjoy, servings that seldom exist on today's mass media. Enjoy my readings of these classic pulp romance stories. Life can't always be a romance story, but you can choose to get lost in one whenever you wish. Let's get lost together. The pulp fiction romance magazine, I Confess, a magazine of personal experiences, published Friday, January 12, 1923, Volume 9, Number 1. Big and brave as a herring, a girl stowaway's daring on the high seas. A freighter on a long voyage is no place for a woman, said the ship's captain to his cheerful bride-to-be at parting, but she, disguised as a boy stowaway, followed and learned the truth of those words. I was to be married on the 15th of June that year, and there never was a girl who looked forward to her wedding day with happier anticipation than I. Gordon Perry was a seafaring man, and at the age of 25, already captain of a 300-ton brig, the Mary Culver. He was enjoying several weeks' shore leave while the Mary Culver was put up for repairs, so, quite naturally, we had selected this as the time for our wedding. I was all aflutter over the preparations. Imagine then my dismay when on the 7th Gordon was summoned to take immediate charge of another ship bound for Havana and due to sail at dawn the next day. Rather than be married in haste, I postponed the wedding, but I was dreadfully disappointed. It was so bitterly hard to be separated from Gordon just then. All at once it came to me that if I were to accompany him on the trip, there need be no parting. But he said decidedly that this was not to be thought of. A freighter on a long voyage was no place for a woman. But, being young and willful and fearless, very much in love too, I did not give proper heed to his words. I didn't go to sleep at all that night. Instead, I lay across my bed, chin propped upon both hands, trying to form some plan by which I might outwit Gordon and sail to Havana with him in spite of his qualms. Finally, an idea came to me which made my cheeks burn with excitement. When everybody else in the house was asleep, I stole softly up to the attic and there, by the light of a lamp, searched until I found the garments which suited my purpose. Back in my room once more, I slipped them on. From shoes to jacket I would easily have passed for my own brother. But above there were the heavy braids of hair wound about my head. In a fever of haste I hacked at the long locks until only a shaggy thatch, like a boy's, remained. A few streaks of lamp-black upon cheek and chin, and I felt my disguise complete. Long before dawn I crept out of the house, and in the guise of a ragged boy was picking my way toward the London docks. I made the short journey without difficulty, but when I reached the docks and found myself fairly in the midst of a great number of ships of every imaginable size and description, I was all at once struck with a panic. For, try as I would, I couldn't remember the name of the ship which Gordon was to sail. The excitement of the night had driven it completely out of my head. Now the appalling thought came to me that the vessel might be miles away before that name came to mind. I started walking about, studying names of as many vessels as I could see. All of a sudden, I came upon one, across the stern of which I spelled out Edel, Edel. That was all. She was lying in such a position that from where I stood, I couldn't see the rest of the name. But like a flash, memory supplied it. Gordon's ship was the Adela, and here by good luck she lay right before me. The deck was alive with sailors, and there were great noises of shouting and bustle of passing to and fro. A group of women approached, wives doubtless of some of the sailors, and started to cross the gangplank. Instantly I saw my chance. Falling in step behind them, I made the deck without hindrance. A glance about showed me that Gordon was not in sight. The fossil hatch lay open, and standing warily to one side, I peered down. Only darkness and silence. My heart beating high with triumph, I scurried down the companion. A streak of early morning sunshine sifting through the dead lights enabled me to get a fair view of the fossil, and my straining eyes traveled up and down the rows of bunks, searching for some place of concealment. At length they fell upon a good-sized locker standing in the shadow under the bitts. I flung up the lid, but for a pile of old papers and a rusty lantern, it was empty, and I scrambled into it, crouching down upon my knees. To this day I can sense the musty odor of tar and old wood, just as it came to me that morning so many years ago as I lay in the ship's locker. I had hardly more than settled myself when I heard a great hullabaloo of shouting and laughter, both from the deck and from the wharf. Then the grating of the gangplank, the creaking of the hawsers, and the vessel quivered beneath me. We were off. My plan had been to make my presence known only after we were well underway, and this, as a matter of fact, was what happened, but not at all in the way I intended. After the sleepless night just passed, it needed only the darkness of the locker and the scantiness of air which filtered through a crack in the lid to send me off to sleep almost at once. I don't know how long I lay there. The next thing I was conscious of was a chorus of raucous voices, then a hand upon the locker's lid. In another minute I was hauled out, blinking and bewildered, upon the floor. A rougher-looking group of men than those surrounding me I never saw in my life, though it may be they were not different from the common run of seamen of that day. One of them grasped me by the shoulder and held me up in the streak of sunlight for the rest to view. What with the lamp black with which I had besmirched my face, and the added mask of dust and cobwebs from the locker, I must have presented a sorry enough appearance. "By the Lord!" cried the seaman who held me, "if it ain't a stowaway!" "About as big and brave as a herring he be," guffawed another. I wrenched myself free and faced the group. "Take me to Captain Perry at once," I commanded, but no one moved. "And who might be he, me hearty?" jeered a man who wore a black patch crookedly across one eye. He spoke with a peculiar drawl, and his name I afterward learned was Ben Cloker. "He's the captain of this ship," I cried hotly, "as you'll learn to your sorrow if you attempt to annoy me." At that, the whole crowd burst into a hoarse shout of laughter, and someone with rough jocularity thumped me on the back with such a blow that I staggered and caught at the nearest bunk for support. Then, all at once, I became both angry and frightened, and as the taunting faces drew in about me, I struck out wildly with both fists. The next thing I knew, something heavy, a sea boot, I afterward learned, came hurtling through the air. I dodged it. A hand shot out and caught me under the chin with a force that turned me dizzy. Then a strong arm lifted me clear off my feet and held me kicking and struggling out of harm's way. "Lay off there, you dirty swabs!" roared a voice. "Do you want to kill the lad?" They fell back a little, some muttering, some guffawing at the picture of a slight, wriggling figure held aloft in the big man's grasp. "Put me down!" I screamed. "I'm going to find Captain Perry this instant." Loony as a fool, poor little devil, spoke one out of the group, a pale, thin-chested young fellow with a deep scar across his cheek. The big man put me down with a brief shake. "Come on now, speak out. Have you got business with the captain?" "I have." And before I could so much as draw breath again, I was being bundled unceremoniously up the companion, with the whole pack at my heels. On deck, all was activity. A thick-set man with a shock of untidy hair was thundering orders to some hands aft of the galley. My big protector spoke up. "Cap'n, here's a young mischief-maker as wants words with you." "And it's loony in the head he is, Cap'n," put in another. The man who was addressed glared at them, and the group fell back silently. Then he turned to me, but before he could speak, I had lifted my chin defiantly. "I asked for Gordon Perry, and no one else," I said. "And who might he be?" "The captain of this ship," I blazed, and heard a murmur behind me. "Loony or no, you'll keep a civil tongue in your head, you young son of a sea lawyer. I'm the master of this ship, and you may lay to that." A terrible fear leaped to my brain. Was it possible that this was not Gordon's ship? I could hardly find my voice. "Isn't this the Adela, bound for Havana?" I asked weakly, and felt all my courage oozing out from my fingertips as I read the answer in the man's face. "Bound for Havana? Right enough, but this here's the Edelise, and it's Captain Seeley you're answerable to, and don't you forget that." I didn't faint, but I came near to it, and I can see now how I owed even the precarious safety that followed to that deathly weakness which fell upon me. For without it I would have blurted out my story in the first moment of amazement, and I shudder to think of what would have lain in store for me. Instead, when things cleared up again, I found myself alone, sitting flat on the deck, leaning against the bulwarks. The men were gone about their duties, and Captain Seeley was nowhere in sight. A hammock was swung for me in the forecastle that night. Half sick with loneliness and dismay, I crept into it, and by the dim, wavering light of the slush lamp, looked about the place. On either side of me rose bunks, one above the other. Not all of them were occupied, but I made out on the upper at my right the form of the white-faced youth with the scarred cheek whom I had noticed before, and below him the man called Cloaker. For hours it seemed I lay there, listening to the wash of the sea against the ship's side, the creaking of the sails, the tramp of the watch above, and all the sounds of a vessel at night that came so strangely to my ear then, though they were to become familiar enough later on. Finally I did close my eyes and fall to dozing fitfully. From one of these naps I was wakened to alert consciousness by a sound. It was so slight that, had I been a little more instead of a little less than half asleep, I should never have heard it at all. Someone was stealing cautiously across the fossil floor toward me. I heard the wary footfalls quite plainly, but fear gripped me so that I did not even open my eyes. At the side of my hammock the steps halted, and I heard a man's breathing. Then a match was struck softly, and I felt its feeble glow upon my face. It traveled deliberately from neck to hair and back again. I don't think I could have screamed if I had tried. Sheer terror had me by the throat. My rigid limbs ached under the strain of holding them motionless, and, as for my heart, thumping like mad against my ribs. It seemed as though its pounding must actually cause the hammock to sway visibly. The man's investigation, though leisurely, was not prolonged. I heard him blow out the match presently and creep away as he had come. All the rest of the night I lay there, scarcely daring to breathe, waiting for what the morning would bring. Day came at last, and I found myself accepted in quite a matter-of-fact way as ship's boy. A more terrible position for a young girl could hardly be imagined, yet not half so terrible as it would have become had I for a moment dropped my disguise. I was remembering too late Gordon's words that a freighter was no place for a woman. It needed only look at the faces of the seamen to convince me of the truth of that statement. 3 times during the horrible days that followed, I started toward the captain's cabin with the truth upon my lips, and 3 times I turned back silently, afraid to speak. All the men, with perhaps one exception, thought me a bit crazy, and this fact, I believe, saved me from many a blow that would otherwise have been mine. But what a life it was, with the work and the coarse food, the wakeful nights, and above all, the fear of discovery which never left me. If I had not been a strong, vigorous English girl, I could never have come through it alive. I hinted above that one of the seamen did not share his companion's opinion as to my mental derangement. This was Ben Cloker, and he was at once a constant puzzle and a terror to me. He had a way of staring at me out of his one good eye and from under the crooked patch that half hid the other that made me want to scream. A dozen times a day I would look up suddenly from my work or glance back as I stood leaning over the bulwarks watching the sea and find his gaze fixed upon me. He was a silent fellow, and his very silence made that eternal scrutiny seem the more ominous. The feeling grew that it was Cloker who had spied upon me in the night, and that he had suspicions which made my secret far from safe. It was after we had been out some 12 days or more and were getting well toward the south that an incident came which turned into tragedy for me. From the start we had had fair weather. Now it grew so intensely hot that I was obliged to discard all but the most essential of the garments I had worn aboard, a pair of short frayed trousers and a cotton blouse. One morning I was pattering barefooted over the forward deck with an immense bucket of water in my hand. I heard one of the seamen exclaim that a vessel was approaching. I turned and, shading my eyes, looked out over the waves. Sure enough, there to the north was a patch of white sail between the blue of the sky and the deeper blue of the sea. She was a long way off, but gaining on us. Because both my mind and my eyes were still fixed on that other ship as I started forward, I somehow stumbled. Over went the bucket, and down went I, flat on the deck, with the water pouring over me. At the moment, I thought nothing of the accident beyond the fact that the mate, who happened to be on the forward deck at the time, was cursing my carelessness roundly. Picking myself up in a hurry, I proceeded to slush off the deck with the spilled water, and supposed the matter ended. But it was not. A little later I descended to the forecastle, and there, unexpectedly, encountered Cloker. I was for darting up the companion again at first sight of him, but he caught my wrist, and holding me so, looked me up and down without a word. "For pity's sake," I exclaimed, exasperated, "what are you staring at?" Then suddenly I remembered that I was soaking wet. I glanced down. The drenched garments clung to me like my own skin. Every curve of my girlish figure was revealed. "Let me go," I cried in fright, but he only grinned evilly. "I've been waiting quite a while, finding you out," he drawled, "but you can't fool Ben Cloker no more." And he caught me to him with a hideous chuckle of pleasure. "Let me go," I screamed again, twisting for the moment out of his grasp. "I'm going to tell Captain Seeley the truth." I stood gasping and sobbing, with my back against the companionway. He folded his arms and faced me, his lip curling. "Yes, you'll tell," he jeered. "Unfortunately, these be seamen as ain't got what you calls company manners with a gal, not aboard ship. But you'll tell, you will." Then, with an entire change of manner, he adopted a wheedling tone. "It's lucky you be that not a soul aboard this here brig has eyes in his head but old Ben Cloker. And he won't say a word, you may lay to that, so you lets well enough alone, you does, and nobody the wiser but you and me." At that he lunged toward me, but, quick as a flash, I ducked, and he was across the floor before he could turn. Then back and forth between the rows of bunks we dodged. Once I caught up a pea-jacket from a disordered bunk and flung it wildly at his face, but, divining my purpose, He caught the thing easily in his hand with a laugh of triumph that I shall never forget. In another moment he would have been upon me, but as I ran, my foot struck against a low stool that stood under the porthole. With a swift backward kick, I sent it spinning across the floor. Cloaker stumbled and fell flat. It was an instant only before he was on his feet, filling the place with the sound of his curses, but in that instant I had made the companion and was rattling up. I heard the man's quick breathing just behind as I gained the deck and started running aft. I was on the left side of the forecastle, so that's when I turned the deckhouse hid me, and so that when I turned the deckhouse hid me for a moment from my pursuer. As I rounded it, out of the tail of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the other vessel. She was overhauling us fast. That one fleeting glance was enough to decide me. Flinging myself over the bulwarks, I hung for an instant to the rail. In that instant, Cloaker rounded the deckhouse after me, grunting and puffing. Then he stopped, with such a look of bewilderment on his face that, frightened as I was, I could almost have laughed. While he stood there, gaping at the empty deck, I loosed my hold upon the rail, at the same time giving a vigorous push with my feet against the ship's side to send me clear of it. Down, down I went with the rush and roar of the water above my head and the pounding of it in my ears. My eyes must have been open, for I remember the great ghostly hull of the vessel looking like a huge shadow beside me. As I came up, the thought flashed in my mind that someone aboard the Edelweiss might have heard the splash and endeavored to rescue me. So, gulping in one brief, grateful breath of air, I dove again to swim underwater a distance of several yards. When I rose to the surface, gasping and exhausted, the Edelweiss was sailing blithely on her course. The last I ever saw of Ben Cloaker was the picture I had of him then, leaning far over the starboard bulwarks, shading his staring eyes with his hand. I flopped over on my back to float, for, what with the mad chase on board the Edelweiss and my plunge into the sea, I was too spent for swimming. Lying there with face upturned, the hot sun glared down so fiercely that I felt as if it was blinding me, and I closed my eyes. So I lay motionless until my breath came naturally once more, and I felt strength returning. When I opened my eyes again, I gave a gasp of dismay. The approaching ship was fairly abreast of me. She was passing. Another moment and she would be beyond the reach of voice or signal. I screamed and threw up one arm. A wave hit me then, and I went under, choking and sputtering. In less than a second, I was up again, swimming madly with one hand and tearing at the throat of my blouse with the other. The old stuff gave easily, and now I had a signal flag, a long, ragged ribbon of cloth that fluttered from my free hand as high above the water as I could hold it. Out of all my life, the moments which recur most vividly to my mind are those when, in an agony of alternating hope and despair, I watched for some sign from this ship. At length, after I had all but given up, it came. A boat was lowered. A few minutes later it was alongside me, and I was hauled in over the gunwale. Hours, perhaps later, I awoke and found myself lying on a ship's bunk. A tall, well-knit figure in a captain's uniform stood over me. I gave a little gasp and rubbed my eyes. "Mary!" cried a voice I knew. I stretched out my arms. "Gordon!" Thank you for listening. Life can't always be a romance story, but you can choose to get lost in one whenever you wish. I hope you enjoyed my sharing of this special piece of fiction from the recent past. You may want to support my efforts, and if so, I invite you to comment, share, and like this presentation on YouTube. You may want to be a part of my classic romance list. You can be notified of my latest presentations. Simply subscribe to my YouTube channel. The subscribe button is on the lower right-hand corner of the header on my channel page, Classic Romance Stories. After you click that, go to the lower left sidebar, click Manage Subscriptions. There's a drop-down box. Check the box Send Me Updates, so that if you wish, you can be notified in your email, the one you have linked to your YouTube Gmail account, when new videos are posted. I invite you to get lost with me in another classic romance story very soon. Stay tuned for the next presentation. Goodbye for now.